Well, hi class, welcome back. I've decided to narrate this asynchronously so you can watch it at your own convenience and just email me any questions that you have. So today we are going to talk about two things regarding time as well as our voice and how we best utilize it. So we're going to go ahead and we will get started here. Today's agenda, we're going to talk about monochronic versus polychronic, and that has to do with the time that you are spending and how you spend your time. And then we're also going to discuss a little bit of persuasive speech, which is going to help you as you work toward that commercial that you have due in this class. So as we dig here into punctuality, we're going to compare it to relationships. I think that it's going to help you relate to the information. The first thing that we're going to talk about is monochronic. And monochronic is something that I think, people tend to do oftentimes when they're on their own, when there's no deadlines. It's when they're able to just focus on one thing at a time. It also means that they're going to be really intensely focused on whatever it is that they're doing. So they're kind of going to zone out. They're just going to look at what it is that they have to do. They're not going to see anything outside of it. And in fact, if you tried to step in and give them other things that they needed to consider at the time, they wouldn't be able to do that. Now, polychronic on the other side is somebody that's more of a multitasker. They can do many things simultaneously. It's not going to bother them. In fact, they may actually feel more productive doing more than one thing at a time. And that means that those that are going to be monochronic, their focus is literally just going to be at the job at hand. They're going to schedule those coordinated activities and they're just going to have them lined up kind of in a to-do list where they just complete one item at a time. Polychronic though, because they have so many different things going on, they're easily distracted. They may be starting on one task right now and then an hour later, they could have already gone through 3 different tasks and not completed any of them. What's important to them is really that interpersonal relationship. They're the ones that are coordinating the activity. So if somebody comes up to you that you really know and you trust and you like, and they say, hey, would you do me a favor and help me out here? You're going to be more than likely to say yes. Now, when we think about attention to time, we certainly have two different styles here. Monochronic is going to think about deadlines. When is it due? Polychronic is going to think about outcomes. What is it that I need to get done? I think it's best to merge these. You're going to notice in the class, even in the time that we got to spend together, that monochronic is important to me. Thinking about the deadlines, making sure that you understand that in the business industries, deadlines are important. So little things like making sure that you're on time for class or that you've communicated appropriately if not. That's thinking about the deadline. That's the monochronic side. Polychronic wouldn't really care when you came to class or even if you came to class. It would be much more relaxed in that aspect. Now, at the same time our class is polychronic, we do think about the outcomes. We want to make sure that you're understanding what it is that needs to be done and how to do it. So we're combining or merging these two items. Of course, deadline is important, but so is the product that you produce. And the grade's going to be affected in both aspects. When we think about the priorities that individuals have when they're monochronic, they're going to be very task-oriented. These fields are often really great in terms of like logistics, accounting, human resources. Those are going to be more monochronic careers, where polychronic is going to be relationship-based. These are going to be people that are in leadership positions, oftentimes going to be found in marketing, business management, anything, sales, hospitality, sports management, all of those kind of paths. It's going to be best if they can be polychronic. But it doesn't mean that just because you're relationship based that you ignore the deadlines. In fact, in business, it's important that you can handle both. Those that are most successful in finance and accounting, although they're task oriented, those that really drive up in their career and are in that top 5%, they're also relationship based. So they're able to have interpersonal relationships, have great communication skills, be able to turn on the extroverted personality type only when needed. And when it comes to punctuality, monochronic emphasizes the promptness, and I love that. But also, polychronic not just promptness, but also priority on the relationship. So what that means is that it depends who you're doing it for. So if your mom asks you for something, you may feel like you can put it off, but if dad steps in and says this needs to be done, maybe it emphasizes the promptness. You likely have two different people in your life, maybe even just faculty. Maybe I am more emphatic on the promptness, so you give opportunity to get your assignments done in my class more promptly, where another instructor may say, have it to me by Sunday, and you have more of that polychronic. You have to prioritize the relationship either way. And then, of course, there are differences in both individualism and collectivism when we're discussing monochronic and polychronic. It's going to be pretty individualized. That's going to be difficult to be interdependent if you're monochronic, where polychronic's going to be very interdependent, and certainly sometimes can be more collaborative than even is what's desired. Now, next, I'm going to quickly go through the difference between persuasion and comprehension. I think these two tie together really well. And when we think about comprehension and sentence length, what you want to think about is how many sentences is appropriate to use given your audience. This is particularly important as you are all starting to write that final paper. I am a college professor. I expect that your sentences are challenging, that you trust that I can understand whatever it is that you're going to write, no matter the sentence length. But here we're going to talk about how important it is to know that audience. So for instance, if you use 25 to 30 words in a sentence, roughly 20 to 30% of the population is going to be able to understand that. That means that 70% wouldn't even be able to understand the sentence that you wrote. Now, most sentences typically are to be kept under 20 words. And that's kind of a magic point because that means that 80% of the population really understands what it is that you're trying to say. There are circumstances where it's best to actually limit your words per sentence into shorter, brief statements so that the majority of the population actually understands. When we analyze somebody like President Trump, we see this in action. If you've ever read his books, you would know that he was using a more complex sentence structure than he uses today in his typical speech. And there's great justification for that. When he was writing the book, he was trying to get toward 80% of the population, which means most of his sentences were about 20 words in length. But today, as he's campaigned, as he's tried to communicate his presidency to the masses, he's trying to reach those of a lower educational level and lower comprehension level as well. Meaning, on average, he's speaking in 5 to 10 word sentences. That's important because what it means is that he recognizes that in order to communicate to 100% of the population, he must keep his average words per sentence below 10 in order to make sure that more than 98% of the population can understand what he has to say. So if you're trying to communicate something and you're feeling like you're misunderstood, make sure to use fewer, not more words to describe what's happening. I think sometimes what we think about is like, oh, I have to explain myself here. And you start to rattle, you start to continue. And that actually comes across as a lie. It harms your credibility. Now, for some people, you may be thinking that the president and truth don't always function correctly. It's probably more likely that fewer words are being spoken. So if there was a greater explanation, maybe it would make more sense or feel more true. But the masses can get on board with a 5 to 10 sentence, word per sentence statement simply because it's brief. It's easy to be understood. Now, don't try to over-explain yourself in these papers either. That's why we make sure that in your speeches and your papers that you have a concise writing ability. When you go to write this paper, however, I'm looking for you to have those 20 words per sentence or greater because of your audience. Now, you have to use action verbs whenever possible. First, you're going to find the nouns that you can convert to action verbs, and then second, you're going to find those forms of the verb to be, or for our French speakers, être. When we're looking at these, we're going to convert those into action verbs as well. So we got to make sure that there's behind our language. Using that active voice is going to help really allow faster processing for people, because most people are naturally thinking in that way anyway. It also emphasizes that business orientation necessary for action. And since we're writing from a professional business standpoint, we also want to connect with the typical mindset, and we're going to combine those things and certainly utilize that active voice and those active verbs. Now, using parallel language also is important here, and it's particularly important when you're reaching multiple audiences at one time. It means that you have to apply a consistent grammatical pattern across a sentence or paragraph. Parallelism is most important when you use the series or lists. I think this is really important when we're writing as well, particularly in formatting. For instance, that's why we're using the Chicago style, is we're able to look at that and say we have a consistent pattern for the way that our paper should read. Now, it's also important, since you're working interdependently with the groups, that you combine into one voice, that it all sounds exactly like one person wrote it. That voice is actually your team voice because you're writing it simultaneously together. Remember, you shouldn't be writing this paper on your own or by dividing it into sections amongst other group members. You should all be sitting down at the computer simultaneously, utilizing something like Google Docs in order to be able to write simultaneously and to put it in one voice. I read these aloud. It's an effort to make sure that I see the parallelism that you're using whenever you're constructing this paper. It's also important to avoid at all costs buzzwords and figures of speech. It distracts your users when you use out of place words or phrases. If you try to sound more intelligent than you are, it's noticeable. You're including words that are not in the typical vernacular, and that can actually harm the readership. Buzzwords and workplace terms that become trite because of overuse, they can actually stir negative feelings among some of your readers. When you think about what those buzzwords are, they certainly change, but the most annoying buzzwords that we find in our book are items like leverage, synergy. It is what it is. It's a real game changer. Circle back to this. Or downsizing, overworked. Are we on the same page? You want to avoid those. You also want to avoid it is and there are statements. Readers naturally want to know precisely who or what the subject of a sentence is, particularly in business writing, where specifically and specificity is so important. I like to think that if you're including it is said or there are people who believe, that really you're just plagiarizing without giving proper credit. So you'll be counted off accordingly. If somebody else has thought it or somebody else has said it, credit must be given. Most sentences that begin with it is or there are fail to provide a specific subject and generally contain more words than necessary. It goes back to our concise writing and says that once you hit that 20 words per sentence, the majority of people in America aren't going to understand what you have to say. And lastly, we're going to discuss conducting a FAIR test. FAIR tests are important to me because it has everything to do with credibility and business. The first part of a FAIR test are the facts. Are you confident in your facts? Are your assumptions clear? Have you researched it properly? This past Friday, you were asked to submit your reference page. That's the facts. That's the information that I'm going to use to assist in determining whether the facts are aligned with the reality. And then next is access. Have you granted enough access to message recipients about the decision-making and information process? Have you granted enough access to the message recipients to provide input? You want to be sure to be open to other people's opinions, other research that may contradict your own. You want to be able to provide that opportunity and that access for people to give you. And so class, I wish you a great week. If you have questions on any of the information that I've provided, please let me know via email or send me a text as most of you have been doing. It's great to stay in contact with you, and of course, I hope to join some of your Zoom meetings later. It's always a challenge when we face a new thing in the workplace, and certainly this is new for all of us here in the classroom as well. But I think that we're all prepared for the challenge. You're in your groups, you're working together, and I think together we get through this strongly. I'm looking forward to your presentations, to the hard work that you're putting forth right now in the writing process, and I wanted to take just a minute to remind you of that writing process. Where you should be in your groups today. One, be sure that you're conducting a meeting now that the research is concluded. And in that, make sure that you have your agenda and your meeting minute notes on how you plan to proceed. It is always important in the writing process to have an outline of the paper before you actually start to write. That means that you're considering all the pieces and parts before you compile them. So this week, what your assignment looks like is creating that outline. I expect the outline to be posted into your Teams folder by Friday before midnight, so 11:59 p.m. or sooner on Friday. An outline of what your paper should look like will be included. Again, if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. Use the Chicago style format to guide you. And as always, have a great week.